She was 6 years old, barefoot, on a frozen Kentucky back road, and she was walking toward the loudest, most dangerous men in the county because her mother told her they were the only ones left who wouldn't let her die. That's where this story begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a police station, in a garage that smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke and bad decisions, where 14 scarred men went completely silent the moment a little girl with blood on her backpack walked through their door. What she was carrying would bring an empire down. What she didn't know yet was that it would cost every single one of them something they couldn't get back. Stay with me until the end of this one. If this story hits you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in this world you're watching from tonight. The cold came in off the fields like something with intent. It wasn't the kind of cold that made you pull your jacket tighter and keep moving. It was the kind that settled into your joints and stayed there, that turned the air above the highway into a gray nothing and made the tree line on either side of Route 9 look like the bars of a cage. November in Harlan County had always been this way, brutal and indifferent, like the land itself had stopped pretending it owed anyone anything. The Black Crow's MC garage sat at the edge of a gravel lot 3 miles off the main highway, half hidden behind a rusted grain silo that hadn't held grain in 20 years. The building itself was a converted auto shop, concrete floors, roll-up bay doors, a loft above the workspace where 3 men slept on cots because they didn't have anywhere better to be. The neon crow mounted above the main entrance flickered in the cold, one wing strobing irregularly, the red glow of it bleeding out across the frozen gravel like something spilled. Inside, the space was loud in the way that men who don't talk much can still make a place loud. Air compressors, classic rock from a speaker missing one channel, the clank of a torque wrench against a lift stand. 8 bikes in various states of repair lined the south wall, their chrome catching the overhead fluorescence in ways that made them look almost alive. 14 men moved through the space or didn't move at all, some working, some leaning against workbenches with coffee, some just existing in the particular way that men exist when they have nowhere they urgently need to be and nothing they urgently need to say. Ridge Callahan was in the back office, which was less an office and more a closet that had been given a desk and a phone jack and the pretense of privacy. He was 51 years old and looked like someone had taken a man in his mid-40s and then been rough with him for another decade. His hair had gone fully gray at the temples, the rest of it dark and cropped close. He had a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and set slightly wrong, a nose in the same condition, and hands that were too large for fine work but very good at everything else. He was wearing the club cut over a thermal shirt, and he was staring at a piece of paper on the desk that he'd already read 4 times without it telling him anything he wanted to hear. The paper was from the county assessor's office. The garage sat on land the club had been leasing since 1997, and the new owner of that land, some LLC out of Lexington whose name Ridge didn't recognize, had sent notice that they intended to terminate the lease agreement effective the following spring. 60 days. Not 60 days to find a solution. 60 days to be gone. Ridge set the paper face down on the desk. There were problems you solved and problems you survived, and he'd been doing both long enough to know the difference usually only revealed itself in hindsight. He pushed back from the desk and stood, and the chair scraped against the concrete floor, and outside the thin partition wall he could hear the men working and the music and the compressor, and for a moment he just stood there in the noise of it and let it be what it was. He'd been president of the Black Crows for 11 years. Before that, he'd been a member for 6. Before that, he'd been inside for 4 years at North Point for armed robbery, a conviction he'd earned honestly and served without complaint, which was the only currency that mattered in a place like that. He was not a good man in the way that term usually gets applied. He'd done things he couldn't undo. He'd made choices that had cost other people, and he carried those costs in the particular way that men who don't believe in absolution carry things, quietly, permanently, and without expectation of relief. What he was, in the ways that counted, was loyal. He was deliberate. He was the kind of man who said a thing once and meant it, who kept the promises he made and didn't make promises he couldn't keep. The 14 men in the garage outside that partition wall had followed him through things that would have shattered most organizations, and he had not led them wrong yet. He intended to keep that record. He opened the partition door and stepped back into the garage. Dex Morales looked up from the bike he was working on, a '94 Sportster he'd been rebuilding for 3 months, and registered Ridge's expression. Dex was 38, built compact and dense, with tattoo sleeves so complete they looked like clothing and a scar along his left jawline that turned white in the cold. He'd done 2 tours in Kandahar before the roads brought him here, and he still sat in the chair closest to the exit whenever he was inside, a habit he'd stopped apologizing for years ago. "Lease?" Dex said. 60 days. Dex set his wrench down on the bench, didn't say anything else. That was the thing about Dex. He absorbed information and then went somewhere inside himself with it. And when he came back, he usually had something useful. Ridge had learned to give him the time. From across the garage, Lenny Briggs called out without looking up from the carburetor he was cleaning. 60 days from when? Letters dated the 9th. So we got till January. Lenny wiped his hands on a rag that was doing more redistributing than cleaning. He was 55, the oldest patched member, with a white beard and a gut and hands that had been broken and healed so many times they moved at slightly unusual angles. He'd been with the club longer than anyone except Ridge. "I know a guy in Corbin who's got a commercial lot sitting empty. Might be something there." I'll call him, Lenny said. "You'll forget." Ridge didn't argue with that because it was probably true. The night settled deeper around the garage. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees since sundown, and the gravel in the lot had frozen to a solid sheet that crunched under boots like broken glass. The neon crow above the door stuttered. Someone had put on a different record, something slower, something with steel guitar. And the men in the garage moved through the blue-gray worklight with the unhurried rhythm of people who had learned not to rush the things that couldn't be rushed. It was Casper Webb, 26, the youngest patched member, barely old enough to have earned the right to be wrong as many times as he had, who heard it first. He was standing near the side door that led to the gravel lot, rolling a cigarette he hadn't lit yet, when he went still in the way that people go still when their body knows something before their brain catches up. He turned toward the door, tilted his head. "You hear that?" he said. Nobody answered him immediately. The music, the compressor, the creak of metal cooling in the cold. "Cass?" Dex said, not looking up. "What?" "Outside." Cass set the cigarette on the bench and put his hand on the door handle. "Something outside." The door swung open and the cold came in like a body checking him, and every man in the garage turned toward the sound of it instinctively, because this was not a place where doors opened at 10:40 on a November night without consequence. The gravel lot was empty and white-gray under the security light, the tree line at the far edge of the property a black smear against the dark sky, and for a moment it seemed like Cass was going to have to stand there and feel foolish. Then they all heard it. Footsteps. Small ones. Erratic, coming from the direction of the road. Not running exactly, but not walking with any confidence either. The kind of gait that belongs to someone moving forward because stopping isn't an option. Cass stepped out onto the gravel. The security light found the figure before his eyes did, a small shape at the edge of the lot, moving toward the garage with a determination that was completely wrong for its size. He processed it in pieces, the way you process things that don't fit any existing framework. Small. Very small. Child height. Moving in the particular way of someone who was cold all the way through and had been that way for a while. "Hey," he said, and his voice came out louder than he intended in the still air. The figure stopped. By that point, Ridge had come through the side door behind Cass, and 3 others were at the threshold, and the security light was doing its indifferent work, and they could all see her now. 6, maybe 7 years old. Bare feet on frozen gravel, hair tangled and damp despite the cold. A backpack that looked too heavy for her, worn on both shoulders, the bottom of it dark in a way that registered wrong. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather, buttoned wrong, 1 button shy of the top, so that it gaped open at her throat. She looked at the men looking at her. She did not run. Her face was doing something complicated and controlled in the way that only a child who has recently stopped crying achieves, which is to say the expression of someone who has used up all their crying and is now operating on some quieter, more terrible mechanism. Ridge stepped past Cass. He moved slowly, which was not natural for him, but something in him understood that speed was the wrong approach here. He walked across the gravel the way you approach something that might startle, hands at his sides, keeping his body loose. He got to within 5 feet of her and stopped. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown and exhausted and 9 years older than the rest of her face. "My mom," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that frightened him more than shaking would have, said the men with the loud motorcycles would keep me alive. 14 men in that garage, and every single one of them went quiet. Ridge knelt. His knees hit the frozen gravel and he felt the cold through the denim, but he didn't register it as important. He was at her level now, looking at her face, and he could see that her lips had gone slightly blue at the corners and that she was shaking in small, controlled pulses that she was working very hard to hide. "Okay," he said. His voice came out lower than he expected. "What's your name?" She looked at him for a long moment, evaluating something. Then, Maisie, I'm Ridge." He didn't extend his hand. He didn't reach for her. He just held position, let the cold do its work between them, waited. "How far did you walk?" Her eyes moved to the right, which was the direction of the main road, and then back. "A long time." From behind him he heard Lenny say something quiet to someone, heard boots shift on gravel, heard the specific texture of the garage going from loud to listening. "Are you hurt?" Ridge asked. She shook her head. Then she looked down at the backpack and something crossed her face that was too complex for a 6-year-old and too familiar for anyone who'd ever had to deliver bad news. "My mom is." Ridge reached out very slowly and put one hand on her shoulder, just the weight of it, nothing more. Through the thin coat he could feel how small she was, how cold. She didn't flinch from the touch. She didn't lean into it either. She just accepted it with a gravity that sat in his chest like something heavy. "Let's get you inside," he said. "Let's get you warm." He stood. He didn't pick her up. Some instinct told him that was wrong, that she needed her feet on the ground. He just walked beside her, matching her pace, back across the gravel and through the side door and into the garage. 14 men. The music had been turned off. The compressor had been turned off. Someone had done those things without being told, and now the garage held a silence that had weight and texture, and every man in it was looking at the girl, and not one of them was moving in a way that might startle her. Dex had already located a folding chair and placed it near the space heater in the center of the garage. Cass had disappeared into the back and returned with a flannel blanket that he held in his hands with the awkwardness of a man who didn't own many soft things. Lenny was putting on a kettle in the small kitchen alcove without being asked, and the sight of him doing it, this massive, scarred, white-bearded man filling a kettle at a utility sink, was one of those images that Ridge knew he'd carry for a long time. Maisie walked to the folding chair and sat down in it and let Cass drape the blanket over her shoulders with the specific care of someone handling something they were afraid of breaking. She clutched the blanket at her chest with both hands. She looked around the garage, at the bikes, at the cut jackets, at the faces looking back at her. "My mom said you'd know what to do," she said to no one in particular. Then she looked at Ridge. "She said to give you this." She reached back and pulled the backpack off her shoulders and held it out to him. He took it. It was heavier than it should have been. The bottom of it was damp and dark, and when he looked at his hand after he gripped it, there was a rust-brown stain at the base of his palm. He didn't open it right away. "Maisie?" He kept his voice even. "Where's your mom right now?" She looked at him, the controlled 9 years too old expression. "She told me to go," she said. "She said don't stop and don't look back." A pause. I looked back. The words sat in the garage like a stone dropped into still water. Dex was already reaching for his phone. Ridge caught his eye and nodded, and Dex moved toward the back of the garage with the phone at his ear. Lenny brought a mug of something hot. Not coffee, something with sugar in it, hot chocolate from a packet that had probably been in the back cabinet for 6 months, and crouched down in front of Maisie with the careful, deliberate movement of a man very conscious of his size. "Here," he said. He held the mug out. "It's hot. Take it slow." She took it. She wrapped both small hands around it, and the contrast, the size of the mug against the size of her hands, hit Ridge somewhere he hadn't been hit in a long time. He carried the backpack to the back office and closed the partition door. He set it on the desk. He stood over it for a moment. The weight of it. The stain on the bottom that was already drying, going darker. He unzipped it. Inside, layered between a child's clothing and a small stuffed animal with one button eye, were two things that didn't belong: a portable recorder, the cheap kind you could get at any electronics store, and a manila folder thick with paper. He picked up the folder first and opened it to the first page. He didn't understand everything he was looking at immediately. It took him several pages, reading slowly, his eyes moving over the columns and the names and the numbers, before the shape of it started to assemble itself. Then he turned to the recorder. He pressed play. The voice on it was a woman's, recorded in a low, urgent register, the voice of someone speaking against time. She stated her name and the date, and then she began to describe, in the particular flat, careful cadence of someone who has rehearsed this, what she knew, what she'd seen, what she'd been part of before she'd understood what she was part of. The names she named were ones that Ridge didn't know, and several that he did, and one of them, the last one she said before the recording clicked off, made him put both hands flat on the desk and breathe through his nose for a long moment. Victor Rowan. He'd heard that name twice, both times in the context of men lowering their voices to say it. He put the folder back in the bag and zipped it. He stood for another moment, hands on the desk, and looked at the wall in front of him, which was covered in pinned schedules and phone numbers and a photo of the full club from 3 years ago, every member standing in front of the garage in the last good light of a September afternoon. He picked up the backpack and went back out into the garage. Maisie had finished most of the hot chocolate. She was sitting with the blanket pulled tight around her and her bare feet extended toward the space heater, and several of the men had arranged themselves in her orbit with the unconscious geometry of people forming a perimeter, not pressing close, just present, filling in the space between her and everything outside the garage doors, in the particular way that large men sometimes do when they've decided something. She was watching one of the younger members, a tall, thin kid named Theo, who was 23 and had a face that still registered surprise as a default emotion, who had apparently been recruited into explaining something about the motorcycle nearest to her. He was doing it with complete seriousness, pointing at the carburetor, and she was listening with the same seriousness, and the normalcy of it against everything else in that room was almost physically painful. Ridge set the backpack down quietly behind the workbench and caught Dex's eye. Dex came to him. "Called in on 9, Dex said, low. "Mile marker 7. Car's still there." Ridge looked at Maisie. "Female," Dex said, quieter. "Multiple." The words settled between them. Dex's expression didn't change. Ridge's didn't either, because they'd both been in places where expressions were luxuries you couldn't afford, and some of that training stayed with you. Who responded? "County." Dex paused. "Reeves was on dispatch." Ridge knew what that pause meant. Reeves meant Burkefield County Sheriff's Department, and Burkefield County Sheriff's Department had a particular relationship with certain names in this part of the state, and one of those names was on the recording in the backpack. "Keep that off the radio," Ridge said. "Already did." Ridge looked at the room again, at the men who had arranged themselves around this girl, at Lenny, who had refilled the mug without being asked, at Cass, who had found a second blanket somewhere and laid it over her feet, at Theo, who was still explaining carburetors with complete dedication because it was the only thing he had to offer, and he was offering it wholeheartedly, at Maisie, who looked up from Theo's explanation and found Ridge watching her and held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment something passed between them that Ridge couldn't name precisely. An acknowledgement, maybe. A recognition. The look of two people who understand simultaneously that their lives have just changed in ways that aren't yet visible. "She stays," he said. Not loudly. He said it to Dex, but he said it at a volume the room could hear, and the room heard it, and nobody argued, because nobody intended to. Dex nodded. It was after midnight when the first call came in on the garage line, the landline, the number that was semi-public, listed on the garage's business registration for the auto repair side of the operation. Ridge let it ring twice, then picked up. The voice on the other end was male, professional, carrying the particular texture of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it to get what he wanted. "I understand you may have something that belongs to me," the voice said. Ridge did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit for 2 full seconds, which is a long time on a phone line. "Wrong number," Ridge said, and hung up. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment, then set it down. Through the partition wall, he could hear the garage, the low sound of men moving carefully, keeping their voices low, the particular hush of a space that has reorganized itself around the presence of someone small and sleeping. He'd looked in 20 minutes ago and found Maisie asleep in the folding chair, the blanket pulled to her chin, Cass sitting on the floor 3 feet away with his back against the workbench, awake, watching the door. Nobody had told him to do that. Ridge went back to the desk and opened the folder again. He read for an hour. The picture that assembled itself was not a simple one. Victor Rowan, Maisie's father, the name on her school records that Dex had found in the backpack's outer pocket, was not a man with a small operation. The ledgers were meticulous, maintained in a handwriting that Ridge now associated with the woman on the recording, a woman who had apparently spent months documenting what she'd witnessed, photographing what she could access, building a record from inside a house where doing so meant she was already dead if discovered. The numbers in the ledgers described movement, product, money, people, across 6 counties. The names in the columns were names attached to positions, 2 county sheriffs, a circuit court judge, the kind of positions that made the word corrupt feel insufficient. He thought about the woman on that recording. He thought about her voice, flat, urgent, rehearsed, and about the moment she would have made the decision to trust this information to her daughter. The moment she would have packed a backpack and given a 6-year-old a direction to walk and a sentence to say when she got there. She'd known about the Black Crows. She'd known enough to choose them specifically. That meant she'd been watching, and it meant she'd made a calculation, and the calculation had led her here. The recording had not explained why she'd chosen them. It had only stated what she knew, what she needed protected, and what she needed done with it. But the last words on it, the ones after the names, after the evidence, after the dates and the details, were not addressed to law enforcement or a journalist or any of the institutions that should have been the natural recipients of what she'd built. They were addressed to him. She'd said his name, Ridge Callahan. On the recording, before it ended, she'd said his name and she'd said, "I watched your club for 4 months before I made this decision. I watched what you are, not what people say you are. I'm trusting you because I don't have anyone left to trust who hasn't already been bought. Please don't prove me wrong." He closed the folder. Outside the partition window, a rectangle of grimy glass looking out into the garage, he could see Cass still on the floor, still watching the door. The space heater glowing orange, the outline of a small girl asleep in a folding chair. He'd spent 23 years building something out of the wreckage of his own life and the lives of men like him. Men who had broken against the world and been broken back and come out the other side of it still functional, still upright, still capable of something if you aimed them right. He'd never been sure what the point of it was. He'd told himself it was about having a place, having brothers, having the road. He'd told himself it wasn't about redemption because he didn't believe in it. He looked at the girl sleeping in the folding chair. He thought about the voice on the recording, the woman who had documented her own death to give her daughter a chance, who had chosen, out of everything available to her, 14 broken men and a garage at the end of a gravel road. He was going to need to make some calls in the morning, the right calls, to people he trusted, which was a short list. He was going to need to figure out where the evidence could go that wouldn't disappear into the same machinery that had swallowed everything else. He was going to need to think about what Victor Rowan would do next and how fast he would do it. And the answer to the first question was obvious, and the answer to the second was probably already in motion. He was going to need to do all of that. But first he went back out into the garage and pulled a second chair over to the space heater and sat down near the sleeping girl, not close enough to crowd, just present, and stayed there until the light through the high garage windows went from black to the specific deep blue that comes before gray. Dex came by at around 3 and left a mug of coffee on the workbench beside Ridge without saying anything. Lenny checked in at 4 and then went back to his cot without asking. Theo, who was supposed to be off shift, materialized out of the dark around 4:30 and took a position near the bay door, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and when Ridge looked at him, he just looked back without explanation. They didn't need one. Maisie woke around 5. She didn't startle. She opened her eyes and she looked at the ceiling, and then she looked at Ridge, who was still in the chair beside her, and he could see her processing where she was, running through the sequence of it, remembering, arriving at the same place she'd left. "You stayed," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep. "Yeah." She looked at her feet, still in the second blanket Cass had put over them. Then she looked around the garage, at Cass asleep on the floor, at the dim shapes of the men on their cots in the loft, at Theo's outline near the bay door, at Dex cleaning apart at the far bench with a flashlight because the overheads were still off. "Are they all still here?" she asked. "All of them," Ridge said. She looked at him. That controlled expression, that exhausted precision. Then something shifted in it, very slightly. The first small crack in the surface of whatever she'd assembled to carry herself 3 miles down a frozen road in the dark. "She told me not to cry," Maisie said. "She said I'd need to save it." Ridge looked at her. "Your mom sounds like she was smart." "She was the smartest." Her voice didn't waver. "She knew everything." He didn't say anything to that. He let it stand, because it deserved to. From outside came the distant sound of a vehicle on the county road. Slow, not passing. Slowing down near the junction that led to the garage's gravel lane, and then, after a moment, accelerating again and disappearing. Ridge tracked it without moving. Beside him, he was aware of Theo tracking it, aware of Dex having gone still at the far bench. The sound faded. Nobody said anything about it. But the air in the garage had shifted in a way that everyone there could feel. That specific change in atmospheric pressure that comes before a storm announces itself, when everything still looks ordinary, but the light has gone slightly wrong, and the animals have stopped moving, and the silence has acquired a texture that silence doesn't usually have. Maisie looked up at Ridge. "They're already looking," she said. She said it the way someone states a fact they've accepted. No particular fear in it, which was more frightening than fear would have been. "She said they'd start looking the same night." Ridge looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "She told me." A pause. "She told me a lot. She said I needed to understand everything so I could explain it to the right people." Her eyes were steady on him. "She talked to me like I was older." "I can see that," Ridge said. "She said she was sorry about that." Another pause, and the pause had a bottom to it. "She said she didn't have time to do it the other way." Ridge put his hands on his knees. He looked at the garage floor. The stained concrete, the oil shadows, the ancient marks of work done in this space over decades. He thought about what it must have been like, in whatever house Maisie had come from, in whatever room a woman sat and talked to her 6-year-old daughter about the way the world was about to end, keeping her voice steady, keeping the panic out of it, giving the child what she needed instead of what she herself needed. He thought about what that kind of love looked like. It looked like a backpack on a frozen road. It looked like a daughter walking into the dark without looking back. Except she had once, and she'd carried that one look the whole 3 miles. "She was right to send you here," Ridge said. Maisie looked at him carefully. "Do you promise?" He held her gaze. This was not a moment for hedging, for qualification, for the careful language of a man who'd learned not to make promises. He knew that. She knew it too, or some part of her did, the part that was older than 6. "Yeah," he said. "I promise." She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she looked back at the heater. "Okay," she said, simply. Finalized. And at that moment the garage phone rang again, and this time the ringtone seemed louder than it had the night before, and every man in the building who was awake went still. And the sound of the approaching daylight through the high windows felt less like morning and more like a clock running down. And Ridge stood and crossed the floor to the partition and picked up the phone and listened. And what he heard on the other end of the line in those 15 seconds turned the cold he felt into something entirely different. It wasn't the same voice as before. It was a voice he recognized, a voice attached to a badge, a voice that was supposed to mean safety, jurisdiction, the machinery of law grinding forward on behalf of the right people. And what it said to him, in the flat, casual tone of a man relaying information he expected to be followed, was that the child needed to be turned over to county custody by 8 o'clock in the morning, and that failure to comply would result in a warrant, and that Ridge needed to understand that this was not a negotiation. Ridge hung up. He stood in the partition doorway, looking out at the garage, at Maisie in the folding chair, at the men around her, at the morning light just beginning to show. He thought about the voice on the recording. I don't have anyone left to trust who hasn't already been bought. Dex, he said. Dex looked up from the bench. Lock it down. Dex didn't ask what that meant. He already knew what it meant. He set down the part he was cleaning and stood and moved toward the bay door. And Theo moved away from the wall, and from the loft above there was the sound of men waking up fast, because the particular tone of those two words had reached them through the floor. And outside on the gravel, the security light was still burning against the last of the dark, and the neon crow above the door was still stuttering, and 8 miles down Route 9 a woman's car was sitting in a ditch in the cold, and somewhere between that car and this garage, a decision had been made that couldn't be unmade. Maisie looked at Ridge from across the room. She said, They already called, didn't they? Not a question. He looked back at her. How many are coming? She asked. And Ridge, who had spent 23 years learning to read the shape of bad situations before they fully arrived, looked at the door and thought about the voice on the phone, and thought about the name on the recording, and thought about a woman who had watched this club for 4 months before she trusted them with everything she had, and said quietly to the 6-year-old girl in the folding chair who had walked 3 miles in the dark to find them, Enough that we need to be ready before they get here. Her face didn't change. She pulled the blanket tighter. Good, she said. My mom said you would be. The 8 o'clock deadline came and went like a door swinging shut. Ridge had counted on that. He'd counted on them giving a deadline because men who use deadlines as leverage usually believed the leverage would be enough. And when it wasn't, there was always a gap between the deadline passing and the next move. A few hours, sometimes longer, while they recalibrated, while they decided what the failure of the first approach meant for the second. He'd used that gap before. He intended to use it now. What he hadn't counted on was the argument. It started at 6:45, which was before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, before the coffee had finished brewing, before most of the men had shaken the night off their shoulders. It started with Paulie Greer, which was not a surprise because arguments usually did. Paulie was 44, had been patched for 7 years, and had a particular talent for identifying the pressure point in any situation and pressing it before anyone else was ready to have the conversation. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had survived by being practical in ways that other men flinched from, and the thing about that quality was that it was genuinely useful right up until the moment it wasn't. He came to Ridge at the workbench where Ridge was laying out what he knew from the folder, cross-referencing it against a county map he'd pulled down from the wall. He came without announcement and stood with his arms crossed and said, without raising his voice, "You need to hear what I'm about to say without it turning into a thing." Ridge looked up. "It's going to turn into a thing," Dex said from across the bench, not looking up from the map he was marking. Paulie ignored that. "She needs to go to the state, Ridge. Not county, state. DSS, CPS, whatever the right agency is. We call them, we explain the situation, we hand over the evidence and let the system do what the system does." He held up a hand before Ridge could respond. "I know what you're thinking, I know, but we are 14 men with records, most of us, and we are in possession of a child whose father is apparently connected enough to have a county sheriff's deputy on speed dial. And if we hold her here, we are not protecting her. We are kidnapping her, and that charge will bury every single one of us before we can do her any good." Ridge looked at him. "I hear you," Ridge said. "Do you?" "I do. You're not wrong about the exposure." Ridge turned back to the map. "But the recording names a circuit court judge. The deputy who called this morning sits under that judge's jurisdiction for everything. And if we hand Maisie to any official channel right now, we are handing her to a system where at least 3 of the key nodes are owned by the man we're protecting her from. You want to tell me how that ends?" Paulie's jaw worked. "You don't know that every node is compromised." "No, I know 3 are. That's enough." "So what's your plan?" Paulie said. "We sit here in a garage with a 6-year-old and wait for Victor Rowan to decide how much force he wants to spend?" "No." Ridge folded the map along a crease that put Route 9 in the center. "We figure out who we can trust outside the county system and we move from there. We have the evidence. That gives us something." "It gives us a target," Paulie said. "That's what it gives us." The word landed in the garage and sat there, and everyone who was awake heard it, and nobody argued with it because it wasn't wrong. From the kitchen alcove behind the partition, Maisie was eating toast that Lenny had made. Ridge had positioned things so she was out of the sightline of the main floor during this conversation, not to hide it from her. He suspected she was tracking every word, but because some conversations needed to happen without a child's face in the periphery. The weight of it changed the math in ways that weren't useful. Paulie lowered his voice. "I got a daughter," he said. "She's 9, lives with her mom in Corbin, and I see her every other weekend, and she doesn't know half of what I've done in my life. But I know what it means to have a kid, and I know what it means to want to protect one." He looked at Ridge with something in his expression that had moved past practical into something raw. "That's exactly why I'm telling you to be careful about this, because if you get this wrong, if we get this wrong, she doesn't go somewhere safe. She goes back to him, and the evidence goes with her." Ridge held his gaze. "I'm not getting it wrong. You don't know that. I know it the same way I knew not to trust Mercer in 2009, and I knew not to run the Knoxville job in 2014, and I knew every other thing I've called in 11 years that you didn't argue with afterward." Ridge said it without heat, without pride, just as a statement of record. "I'm not infallible, but I'm asking you to hold the argument until I give you a reason to have it." Paulie looked at him for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and picked up a coffee mug from the bench and didn't say anything else, which was Paulie's version of standing down, and Ridge accepted it for what it was. The argument, though, didn't end there. It just moved. By 9 o'clock, it had reached Garrett Sims, who was 36 and had done 18 months for assault, a bar fight that had gotten out of hand in ways he'd never fully explained, and who had a different angle than Paulie but arrived at the same destination. Garrett didn't come to Ridge directly. He went to Dex, which was its own kind of signal, because going to Dex meant going to the man Ridge trusted most to translate things clearly. Dex came to Ridge at 9:15. "Garrett thinks we should move her, tonight, get her out of the county, somewhere the name Victor Rowan doesn't reach, let the federal piece work itself out from a distance. Moving her makes us look guilty." "We are guilty," Dex said. "Technically. Right now, under the law as it currently applies to this situation, we have taken a child from... Nobody took her from anything. She walked in. That distinction will not survive contact with a warrant." Ridge rubbed his face with both hands. He was running on 3 hours of bad sleep and too much coffee, and a kind of focused tension that he recognized as the specific fuel his body produced when things were genuinely bad, which was useful but had a finite supply. He needed to be careful with it. "I'm not moving her in the dark with no destination and no legal cover," he said. "That's not protection, that's flight, and it makes everything worse." Dex nodded slowly. "Okay." A pause. "You should know that Garrett is not the only one thinking it." "How many?" 4, maybe 5. Nobody's talking loud, but they're talking." Ridge processed that. 5 out of 14 was not a majority. It was also not nothing. "Are they going to hold?" "They'll hold." Dex looked at him steadily. "But they need something to hold too. They need to see you've got to move." "I've got to move." "Then let them see it." Ridge looked out across the garage floor, at the men moving through their morning, some eating, some working, some sitting in the particular still way of people waiting for something to break. He could see the shape of their worry without needing to read faces. These were not men who scared easily. They'd been through things. But this was different. This wasn't road trouble or legal pressure or the ordinary friction of living outside the lines. This was a child in a folding chair, and a dead woman's voice on a recorder, and a name powerful enough to have county law enforcement making early morning calls. And the weight of it pressed on the garage in a way that the ordinary kind of pressure didn't. He thought about what Dex had said. "They need to see you've got to move." "Get me Holloway's number," Ridge said. Dex raised an eyebrow. "Marcus Holloway?" "Yeah." "That bridge has been out for a long time, Ridge." "I know." Ridge looked at the partition wall, beyond which Maisie was eating toast with Lenny. "Get me the number anyway." Marcus Holloway was not a biker. He was a federal investigator. Retired, technically, though the word retired sat on him about as well as it sat on Ridge, which was to say it was a label more than a condition. He'd worked organized crime for 20 years out of the Lexington field office, and he and Ridge had a history that was complicated in the specific way that histories between law enforcement and men like Ridge were always complicated. Mutual use, mutual wariness, a grudging respect built on a foundation of exactly 3 moments in which each of them had done something for the other that they hadn't been required to do. The last time they'd spoken was 4 years ago. It had not ended well. Ridge called the number from the back office. Standing at the desk, the door closed. The phone rang 7 times. He was preparing to leave a message when the line picked up. Silence. Then, "I heard you retired." "I heard the same about you," Ridge said. A pause that had texture. "What do you need, Callahan?" "I need to know if you still have federal contacts that aren't contaminated by county money." Another pause, longer. "That's a specific question." "I've got a specific problem." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a man recalibrating, running through what he knew about Ridge, what Ridge calling him meant against the backdrop of whatever Holloway had been doing with his retired mornings. Then, "What county?" "Burkefield." "How bad?" "Circuit court judge. At least 2 deputies, probably more I haven't mapped yet. And a name you might know." Ridge said the name. The silence that followed that was very different. It was the silence of recognition, of a piece clicking into a place that had been waiting for it. "How recent?" Holloway asked. "Recent enough. I've got documentation, ledgers, recordings, primary source." "Where's the source?" Ridge looked at the partition door. "Not available." Meaning not available. He let that sit. "Can you connect me or not?" Another long pause. "This is going to require me to make calls I'd rather not make, to people who are going to ask me questions I'd rather not answer about how I came to be involved in something in Burkefield County." A breath. "You understand what I'm trading here." "I understand. And you're asking me to do it anyway." "I'm asking you because you're the only person I trust not to have already been bought." He could hear Holloway breathing on the other end of the line, could hear something in the background, a television or maybe a radio, the quiet noise of a man's morning interrupted. "Give me 6 hours, Holloway said finally. "I've got fewer than that before they move." "Then give me what you've got and let me work faster." Ridge thought about the folder, about the recorder, about the voice on it saying his name at the end. He thought about putting that evidence in the hands of another person, the specific vulnerability of it, the weight of trusting someone else with the only leverage he had. Then he thought about what Paulie had said. "That's exactly why I'm telling you to be careful." "I'll get you copies," he said. "Originals stay here." "Agreed." "And Holloway." Ridge put one hand flat on the desk. "If this goes sideways because someone on your end is connected, it won't. But if it does..." A pause. "Then we're both in trouble," Holloway said, "which is the only honest answer I can give you." Ridge hung up. He stood in the office for a moment, the paper from the assessor's office still face down on the corner of the desk where he'd put it the night before. The lease. 60 days to be gone. In the scale of everything that had arrived in the garage since then, the lease had become a different kind of problem, smaller and larger at the same time. A reminder that the ordinary pressure had been there before the extraordinary kind arrived, and would be there after, and that the ground was always moving under everything. He picked up the assessor's notice and put it in the desk drawer. Then he went back out into the garage. The late morning moved in its own way, neither fast nor slow, but with a kind of compressed quality, like time itself was aware it was being watched. Ridge had Dex photograph every page of the folder and every side of the recorder while the original evidence stayed locked in the back office safe. He'd had the safe for 12 years and had never put anything in it except the club's founding documents and a photograph he didn't talk about. He put the backpack in beside them and locked it. Maisie had finished with breakfast and migrated to the garage floor, where Theo had apparently decided that teaching her the names of tools was a reasonable project for the morning. She sat cross-legged on a piece of carpet they'd laid out near the space heater, and Theo sat across from her with a tool roll spread between them, and he was picking up each tool and naming it, and she was repeating the name back with the focused seriousness of someone studying for an exam. "Torque wrench," Theo said. "Torque wrench," Maisie repeated. She picked it up with both hands, tested the weight. It's heavy. That one's medium, the big one's heavier. Why do you need different sizes? Theo considered this. Different bolts need different amounts of tight. She thought about that. Too tight is bad. Too tight breaks it, too loose falls off. So you have to know how tight. That's the whole job, Theo said, knowing how tight. Ridge stood at the edge of the floor and watched this for a moment. He was aware of what it was doing to him, and he let it do it, and then he set it aside, because the garage was not a safe place and the morning was not going to hold, and he had 14 men who needed a president today, and not a man standing on the floor watching a child learn tool names and feeling things about it. He crossed to where Lenny was refilling his coffee at the alcove. Lenny passed him a mug without turning around. "She eat enough?" Ridge asked. "2 pieces of toast, half a banana." Lenny turned. "She asked me about the bikes." "What about them?" "She wanted to know which one was yours." He sipped his coffee. "I showed her. She said it was bigger than she expected." A pause. "She said her mom said you'd be a big man." Ridge looked at his coffee. "How did her mom know anything about me specifically?" Lenny gave him a look. "You ever think about how long this woman was watching us before she made her move? 4 months, according to the recording. That's 4 months of sitting somewhere. Maybe a car on the county road, maybe someone else's place with a view, and watching this garage, watching who went in and out, watching how the men moved, how they talked to each other." He set his mug down. "You don't watch a thing for 4 months and know the president's name and not learn a lot about it." Ridge thought about that. About a woman sitting in a car in the dark on a county road, watching the neon crow flicker above the garage door. Watching 14 men and making calculations about them. Building a trust that had no institutional backing, no recommendation, no formal reason for existing, just observation and a desperate conclusion drawn from it. "She could have gone 100 different ways," Lenny said quietly. "With what she had. She could have found a journalist. She could have made it to a field office in Lexington before they got to her. She watched us, and she picked us." "Doesn't make her right," Ridge said. "Doesn't make her wrong either." Lenny picked up his mug again. "What I'm saying is, that woman wasn't stupid. She was the opposite of stupid, and she saw something worth betting her daughter's life on." He walked away before Ridge could answer. It was Dex who picked up the tale. He'd gone out at 11 to get a visual on the county road, a routine he'd started without being asked because it was the kind of thing Dex did, anticipating the next need before it was articulated. He came back in through the side door with snow on his shoulders, which meant the temperature had dropped enough for the clouds to deliver, and he went straight to Ridge with the particular stillness that meant he'd seen something. "Blue pickup," he said. "Sitting on the county road junction. Can't see the plates from here, but the angle is wrong for a parked vehicle. Driver's side window is cracked. Watching the lane. Since at least 10. Wasn't there when I did the 6 a.m. check." Ridge thought about the gap between the deadline and the next move. He'd calculated that gap in hours. The blue pickup suggested he'd overestimated it. "1 vehicle?" "That I can see." "1 vehicle means they're not ready to move yet. They're confirming she's still here." Dex nodded. "We give them confirmation, they make the call. The next thing that comes down that lane won't be a pickup." "How long before they decide the watching is done?" Dex considered. "End of day. Maybe before." That shrank everything. Ridge looked at the floor for a moment, running through what he had, what he needed, what the order of operations was. Holloway had asked for 6 hours. He wasn't going to get 6. He was going to get 4, maybe 3. "Get me Sal," he said. Salvador Vega, Sal, was the only member of the Black Crows with a law degree. He hadn't practiced in 11 years, had surrendered his license after a disbarment proceeding he didn't argue against, for reasons he'd explained to Ridge privately once, and that Ridge had kept private since. But the knowledge remained, and Ridge had learned to use it, and Sal had learned that being useful in this particular way was how he justified his presence in the club to himself on the nights when old choices pressed down on him. Sal came to the back office, and Ridge closed the door and laid out what he had: the evidence, the phone call, the circuit court judge named in the ledgers, the deputy who'd called in the morning, the deadline that had passed. Sal listened without interrupting, which was another remnant of his former life. And when Ridge finished, Sal was quiet for a moment, running through it. The judge creates a problem, he said finally. If a custody petition gets filed before you can establish the evidence is legitimate and in the hands of an uncorrupted authority, the judge can sign off on temporary placement and you have no legal standing to refuse transfer. Can they file that fast? With a cooperative judge? Sal looked at him. This afternoon. That landed harder than Ridge had expected. He showed none of it. What do I need to block that? Federal jurisdiction. If a federal agency opens an active investigation tied to the evidence you have, it creates a preemption argument. A county judge can't sign over custody of a material witness in an active federal investigation without creating serious obstruction issues. He paused. But you need the investigation opened, and you need it documented before the county petition is filed. I'm working that. How close? Closer than I was an hour ago. Sal looked at him steadily. There's a window here, Ridge, a narrow one. If Rowan's people move faster than your contact, the window closes, and we are holding a child illegally against a valid court order, and everything we have becomes inadmissible because of how it was obtained. He let that settle. That's the legal reality. I understand the legal reality. I need to know that you understand it fully, because the version of this where we do everything right and still lose is real. I understand it fully, Ridge said, and I'm asking you to trust that the version where we do everything right and it works is also real. Sal looked at him. Then he nodded, once. What do you need from me? I need you ready to talk to a federal contact the moment I have one with jurisdiction. I need the language ready to go. I'll have it. The afternoon broke badly. At 1:17, Paulie came in from the lot with his jaw set in the specific way it got when he'd seen something he didn't want to have seen, and he went straight to Ridge without stopping. Second vehicle, he said. East side, up on the Ridge Road, different angle. They've got line of sight on the back of the building now. How many in it? 2. Different plates than the pickup. 2 vehicles with overlapping coverage meant they weren't worried about the watching being spotted anymore, which meant the decision to move had already been made and they were in the setup phase. Timeline just moved up, Ridge said. Paulie looked at him with an expression that was past argument now, past the practical calculation, down to something more fundamental. Tell me you've got something, Ridge. I've got something. Tell me it's real. It's real. Ridge met his eyes. Hold the room together for me. 2 more hours. Paulie held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he walked back out into the garage. It was the sound that came next that Ridge would remember longest. He was in the back office, on the phone with Holloway's contact, a woman named Reyes in the organized crime division of the Lexington field office, competent and careful and moving exactly as fast as Ridge needed, which was fast enough. When he heard Maisie's voice rise in the garage, not scared, not crying, something else, he finished the sentence he was in the middle of, told Reyes to hold, and opened the partition door. She was standing near the workbench where Theo had left the tool roll, and she was looking at the bay door which was closed, and her face had done the thing again, the controlled old thing, but different now. There was something specific in her expression that Ridge hadn't seen before. Recognition. What is it? He asked. She pointed at the bay door. Outside, muffled by the steel, came the sound of a vehicle on the gravel, not moving fast, moving slowly, the specific crawl of something that isn't announcing its arrival but wants to be seen. That's one of his, she said. Everyone in the garage had gone still. You've heard that engine before? Ridge asked. It's a black SUV, she said. He has 2 of them. They always drive slow like that. She looked at Ridge, and in her eyes was the specific combination of fear and recognition and absolute certainty that belongs to someone who has been afraid of exactly this sound for a long time. That's how they came before. The garage was completely quiet now. No compressor, no music, no boots on concrete, just 14 men who had collectively stopped breathing, listening to the slow crunch of gravel under tires outside their door. And from the phone in Ridge's hand, Reyes's voice still on the line. Callahan, you there? He put the phone to his ear without taking his eyes off Maisie. Yeah, he said. "I need you to move faster." Outside, the engine cut, and in the silence that followed, Ridge heard a second engine cut, from the east side of the building, and then a third, from the direction of the county road. 3 vehicles, stationary, surrounding 3 sides of the building. Maisie looked at him. She said, very quietly, the way someone says something they've already accepted, "They brought enough." And Ridge, looking back at her, understood that the gap he'd counted on had already closed, and the careful window Sal had described was shutting, and the next 10 minutes were going to determine everything. Not just for the girl in front of him, not just for the 14 men around him, but for something larger and older that had been building in this story since a woman sat in a car on a dark county road and watched these broken men and decided they were worth betting the only thing she had left. He put the phone back to his ear. "Reyes," he said, "listen carefully." Outside on the gravel, a door opened, boots hit the ground, and from somewhere above, the loft, where 2 men had taken positions without being told, came the low, deliberate sound of a slide being racked. The sound moved through the garage like a current, touching each man, straightening spines, settling jaws, turning faces toward the bay door with the particular focus of people who have arrived, without choosing it, at the moment they've been quietly preparing for their whole lives. Maisie stepped back from the bay door. She stepped back until she felt Ridge's hand on her shoulder, and she stopped there. "Don't let go," she said. He didn't. Outside, the boots on the gravel stopped moving. Then a voice, amplified, a speaker on one of the vehicles, professional and flat. "This is Deputy Kenneth Waller, Burkefield County Sheriff's Department. We have a court order for the transfer of a minor. Open the bay door and present the child. You have 5 minutes to comply." The voice echoed off the grain silo and came back distorted, and then it was just the cold and the silence and the gray November light coming in through the high windows, and Maisie's shoulder under Ridge's hand and the phone against his ear, and Reyes saying something he could barely track. And then her voice sharpened and she said, "Callahan, the petition. It was filed this morning. We just found it. It went through a circuit judge named—" She paused, reading, "Harmon," the name from the ledger. Ridge closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. The window closes, and we are holding a child illegally against a valid court order. When he opened them, Maisie was looking up at him. "What does that mean?" she asked. She'd heard it in his face. He looked down at her. He thought about a woman who had watched these men for 4 months and arrived at the only conclusion that didn't lead to her daughter's death. He thought about the weight of that choice and what it had cost and what it still required. "It means," he said, "that we just ran out of time to do this the easy way." Maisie held his gaze, and in her eyes, exhausted, old, 6 years old and 30 years old at the same time, was not the fear he'd expected to find. It was something closer to resolution. "My mom knew there wasn't an easy way," she said. "That's why she sent me to you." Outside, the amplified voice began the count. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. That was what remained on the count when Ridge made the call that couldn't be unmade. He put Reyes back on the phone and said 7 words. "I need federal jurisdiction declared in the next 3 minutes." He said it the way you say things when the room behind you has 14 men who are waiting on your voice and a child who is waiting on your hand, and the world outside the bay door has already decided what it wants and is counting down to taking it. Reyes said, "I can't manufacture jurisdiction, Callahan." "You don't need to manufacture it. It's already there. You said it yourself. The petition went through Harmon. Harmon is in the ledger. That makes the custody order itself part of the criminal architecture. That's obstruction of a federal investigation the moment you open one." Silence on the line, the kind that meant she was thinking and didn't want him to hear her thinking. "If I open an investigation on incomplete intake, you open it on what you have, the recordings, the ledger copies, the documented connection between Harmon and Rowan. That's enough for a preliminary." He kept his voice flat, kept the urgency out of it, because urgency on a line like this made people cautious, and caution was the enemy of the next 3 minutes. "You know it's enough." Another silence. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. "Hold the line," Reyes said. Ridge held it. He did not look at the bay door. He did not look at Maisie. He looked at the far wall of the garage. The photo of the full club from 3 years ago, 14 men in September light. And he breathed at a rate he'd taught himself in a prison yard where the air was never enough, and the thing you controlled was always your own body first. Dex was at the south window, angled back from the glass, watching the gravel lot. He held up 2 fingers without turning around, 2 visible, which meant at least one more he couldn't see. From the loft, nothing, which meant the 2 men up there were holding and steady, which was the only thing he'd asked of them, the only instruction that mattered: hold until I tell you different. Whatever happened in the next 3 minutes, nobody in this garage was going to be the one who started the version of this that ended with people on the ground. 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Polly was at the partition doorway watching Ridge. His arms weren't crossed, his hands were at his sides. That was the difference. The uncrossed arms. And Ridge understood what it meant. Polly had made his peace with whichever direction this broke. He was ready. Garrett was near the side door, not to run. There was nowhere to run to, but because Garrett's body always needed a door within reach, an old damage that expressed itself as proximity to exits, Ridge had stopped reading it as threat a long time ago. 2 minutes. Maisie had not moved from the spot beside Ridge's hand. She was looking at the phone in his hand, not at the bay door. She understood somehow that the phone was where the decision lived right now. "My mom made copies," she said quietly. Ridge looked down at her. "What?" "Before she made the backpack. She said she made copies and gave them to someone she trusted." Maisie's voice was even, the rehearsed quality again, the voice of a child delivering information she'd been asked to carry. "She said if anything happened to the backpack, there was another way." Ridge stared at her. "She told you this?" "She told me to say it to the right person at the right time." She looked up at him. "She said I'd know when." 1 minute 30. "Who'd she give the copies to?" Ridge asked. "She said his name was—" Maisie stopped, frowned. The specific frown of a child trying to hold a word she'd memorized. Holloway. The name hit Ridge like cold water across the back of the neck. Marcus Holloway. The woman had gone to Holloway too, had reached him separately through some channel Ridge didn't know, and had given him a parallel set of the evidence, a backup, a second key to the same lock, which meant Holloway had known about this before Ridge called him this morning, which meant the conversation they'd had, the careful, cautious, reluctant conversation, had been a performance of reluctance over a bed of knowledge that was already there. Ridge put the phone back to his ear. "Holloway," he said. But it wasn't Reyes on the line anymore. The line had transferred or switched or something had happened in the background because the voice that came back to him was one he knew and was not expecting. "Yeah," Holloway said. "She gave you copies." A pause. "She did." "When?" 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. Ridge stood very still. "And you waited." "I was building intake. You can't walk into a federal building with evidence against a circuit court judge and 2 county sheriffs without a complete package. If you do it half-built, they bury it and they come after you." Holloway's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man stating his reasoning to someone who has every right to reject it. "I needed 3 more days. I don't have 3 days. I have about 45 seconds. I know." A breath. "Reyes has the intake order. She's signing it now. But Ridge—" Holloway paused, and the pause had a shape to it, an edge that Ridge felt before he could explain why. "There's something else in the copies she gave me, something that wasn't in what you described to me this morning." The amplified voice outside started again. 2 minutes. "What?" Ridge said. "The ledger she kept. The full one. Not just the financial records. It has names, more names than you've seen, and one of them is someone you know." The garage seemed to contract slightly. "Who?" Ridge said. Holloway said a name. Ridge heard it. He stood in the center of his garage with the phone against his ear and 14 men around him and a 6-year-old beside him and a count running down outside his bay door. And he heard the name, and for approximately 4 seconds, nothing in him functioned in the way things normally function. The name was not a stranger's name. It was not a name from the ledger's list of sheriffs and judges and unknown infrastructure. It was a name he'd known for 9 years, a name that had sat at his table and drank his coffee and worn the same cut as every man in this room. It was Dex's name. Not Dex, not Dexter Morales, who was standing at the south window right now with his back to Ridge. Not the man who had handed him coffee in the dark at 3 in the morning. Not the man who had racked the plan for the morning without being asked. Who had gotten the number for Holloway. Who had suggested Ridge show the men a move. But the name in the ledger was Morales D., and the entry beside it was 18 months old, and the figure beside that entry was a number large enough to mean only one thing. 1 minute, said the voice outside. Ridge looked at the back of Dex's head. 9 years. 2 deployments before the club. Kandahar, places Ridge had only heard named. The scar on his jaw. The chair by the exit. The loyalty that had never wavered in all the time Ridge had known him. Except 18 months ago, according to a dead woman's ledger, someone named Morales D. had taken money from Victor Rowan's network. And the entry beside the money was described in 2 words. Access provided. Ridge lowered the phone. He did not say anything. He did not move toward Dex. He stood in the center of the floor and breathed and tried to build a framework in which the name in the ledger and the man at the window existed in the same world without one of them destroying the other. He couldn't build it fast enough. 30 seconds, the voice outside said. Dex turned from the window. He looked at Ridge across the garage floor. His face was exactly the face Ridge had always known. Careful, still, carrying its damage cleanly. He registered something in Ridge's expression, because he was not a man who missed things. And when he registered it, his own face changed in a way that was very small but very clear. He knew. Somehow, in the specific way of a man who has been carrying a secret long enough that he knows what its discovery looks like on someone else's face, Dex knew that Ridge knew. The garage was silent. The amplified voice outside, "Comply now or we will." And then it stopped. Not a pause. A stop. Mid-sentence, the way a broadcast stops when the signal is cut. Everyone in the garage held position for 3 full seconds, listening to the sudden absence of the voice. Then Reyes came back on the phone in Ridge's hand. Federal hold is in place. They've been served notice. They cannot enter or execute the order. A pause. You have about 20 minutes before their supervisor gets involved, and the legal argument starts. Use them. Ridge didn't respond to her. He was still looking at Dex, and Dex was still looking at him. Not moving. Not toward the exit, not toward anywhere, just standing at the window with the snow-gray light behind him and his hands at his sides and the old scar white along his jaw. "Everybody out," Ridge said. He said it quietly, to the room. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Paulie took a step toward the side door, and the movement unlocked the others. Lenny, Garrett, Theo, Cass, the rest. All of them filing toward the exits with the careful, deliberate movement of men who understood what the instruction meant. Theo paused near Maisie and crouched down. "You want to come with me?" he said to her. She looked at Ridge. Ridge gave her a short nod. She stood and followed Theo toward the kitchen alcove, and the partition door closed behind them. And then it was just Ridge and Dex in the garage, standing 40 feet apart on the concrete floor, and the overhead fluorescents, and the bikes along the south wall, and the cold coming in under the bay door. Dex spoke first. "How much?" he said. "Enough." Dex looked at the floor, then back up. "It was 18 months ago." "I know when it was." "Then you know it was before." He stopped, started again. "There are things I need to explain." "Then explain them," Ridge said. His voice was not loud. It was not heated. It was the voice he used when he was most dangerous, and both of them knew that. Dex was quiet for a moment. He moved to the workbench and leaned against it, not sitting, just putting something solid at his back. And Ridge recognized the posture. It was the same posture Dex used in rooms he didn't fully trust. The posture of a man trying to control his own vulnerability by managing his physical position. "My sister," Dex said. "You know she was in trouble with Rowan's people. You knew that much." "I knew she'd had dealings in Lexington. I didn't know the specifics." "The specifics were that she owed them money. Real money. The kind they collect on in a specific way." He looked at the floor. "I had 6 weeks before they were going to collect. And I didn't have the money, and I didn't have a way to get it that didn't involve this club, and something I didn't want this club in." A pause. "So I made a different arrangement." You gave them access to what? Routing information for a single shipment. One time, one night, information that let one truck go through a checkpoint without being stopped. He looked at Ridge. I gave them one pass. I got my sister out. I told myself it was contained. Ridge looked at him for a long time. One pass on Rowan's network puts you in Rowan's ledger. I know. Being in Rowan's ledger means that when his ledger becomes evidence in a federal investigation, your name is in it. I know. Dex's jaw worked. I've been living with that for 18 months. I thought, when nothing came of it, when no investigation materialized, I thought it had gone the way those things go. And then a little girl walked through our door with the ledger in her backpack. Dex said nothing. The garage held the silence between them. Outside on the gravel, Ridge could hear movement. The county vehicles still present, waiting. The federal hold buying time, but not permanence. He had 15 minutes, maybe 12 now. Were you going to tell me? Ridge asked. Dex looked at him. In his face was the particular expression of a man who has asked himself that question in the dark too many times to have a clean answer. I don't know, he said. And the honesty of it, the refusal to give Ridge the easier lie, was the only thing in the room that didn't feel destroyed. Ridge turned away. He put both hands flat on the nearest workbench and looked at the wall in front of him. The schedules, the phone numbers, the photograph. He looked at the photograph. 14 men in September light. He found Dex's face in it easily. The compact frame, the crossed arms, the expression that wasn't quite a smile. He thought about what betrayal actually was. He'd been betrayed by men who'd done it with intention, with greed, with the specific cold arithmetic of choosing themselves over the people who trusted them. He'd seen that kind. He knew what it looked like and what it felt like and how it left its mark. This was not that. This was a man who had made one wrong decision for reasons that Ridge understood in his bones. Because he'd made decisions from the same place. The place where someone you love is in danger, and the available options are all bad, and you pick the least bad one and spend the next 18 months hoping the floor doesn't fall out. He'd been there. Every man in this club had been there in some form or another. That didn't make it clean. It didn't make the ledger entry disappear or the exposure go away or the position it put all of them in any less serious, but it changed the shape of what he was deciding. When the federal investigation opens formally, Ridge said without turning around, your name is going to be in the intake. There's no way around that. I know. That means you have a choice to make. You get out ahead of it. Full disclosure, cooperation, everything you know about that transaction and every name attached to it. Or you wait and it comes out on their terms. He turned around. If you cooperate and the evidence shows it was a single transaction under duress, there's an argument. If they find it themselves, there isn't. Dex was very still. You're telling me to turn myself in. I'm telling you what the options are. And the club? Ridge looked at him. That's a separate conversation. Right now I need to know if you're in or out, because in about 10 minutes I'm going to walk out that bay door and start the version of this where we fight it through legal channels with federal backing, and I need to know who's standing beside me when I do. Dex looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at the bikes along the south wall in the way that men look at things they've built their lives around when they're trying to calculate what those things are worth. In, he said. Ridge held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and went to the partition door. Maisie was sitting at the kitchen table with Theo, who had been talking to her steadily about something, keeping her occupied, keeping her voice engaged. And when Ridge came in, she looked up at him with the calibrated wariness of a child who has learned to read rooms through closed doors. Did something happen? She asked. Some things are getting sorted out, Ridge said. He pulled a chair and sat across from her at the table. He needed to look at her directly for what he was about to say, because she had earned that, and her mother had earned it, and the full weight of what had been given to these men deserved to be received without deflection. Maisie, the man outside with the badge and the court order, he can't take you right now. There are federal people working on making sure of that. But it's going to take more time, and while that time is happening, there are going to be more people coming, and the situation outside this building is going to get harder before it gets easier. She looked at him with the old eyes. How much harder? I don't know exactly, but I want you to know that every person in this building is going to be here when it does. You understand what I'm telling you? She looked at him. "You're telling me not to be scared." "No," he said. "I'm telling you it's okay to be scared and that we're not going anywhere." She processed that. There was a difference, and she recognized it, and the recognition moved across her face in the small, specific way of a child receiving something they needed and didn't know how to ask for. "Okay," she said. It was Cass who came through the partition door 20 seconds later with his jaw tight and his eyes carrying the specific look of someone who has seen something outside and is choosing how to present it. He looked at Ridge over Maisie's head. "New vehicle," he said. "Not county plates." Ridge stood. "Private," Cass said. "Black SUV. Plates are—" He checked the note he'd written on his hand. "Registered to a law firm in Lexington." A law firm. Not law enforcement. Not Rowan's direct crew. A law firm, which meant lawyers, which meant the legal architecture was already in motion, which meant the next move in this sequence was not going to come through the bay door with a badge and a speaker system. It was going to come through a courtroom. Ridge thought about what Sal had said that morning, with a cooperative judge, this afternoon. Harmon had signed the petition already. Now there was a black SUV from a Lexington law firm parked on his gravel, and the federal hold had bought minutes, not days, and Reyes was still building intake at the other end of a phone line, and somewhere between the federal hold and the law firm and the judge and Rowan and the ledger and the name in the ledger and a dead woman's recordings, the shape of the battle had shifted. It had shifted from a door they could defend to a legal argument they couldn't win without the right pieces in the right hands at the right time, and some of those pieces had just moved in ways he hadn't planned for. He was in the partition doorway when the knock came. Not the bay door. The side door. The human door. The one people used when they weren't announcing themselves with vehicles and counts. 3 knocks. Even spaced, deliberate. Not law enforcement. Law enforcement didn't knock like that. Not Rowan's people. They didn't knock at all. Ridge went to the side door. Dex materialized at his left shoulder, Cass at his right. He opened it. The man standing outside was approximately 60, wearing a suit coat over a flannel shirt, in the specific combination of someone who'd started the day in an office and ended up somewhere they hadn't expected. He was not large. He had wire-rimmed glasses and gray hair cut close, and the specific careful stillness of a man who had spent decades managing the space between himself and volatile situations. He was holding a manila envelope. "My name is Gerald Fitch," he said. "I'm counsel for the estate of Claire Rowan." He paused. "I've been waiting for this knock for 3 months." Ridge looked at him. "Come in." Fitch came in. He looked around the garage, at the men, at the bikes, at the partition where Maisie was, and something in his expression settled, the specific settling of someone who has been worried about something for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where they find out if the worry was warranted. "She prepared for multiple outcomes," Fitch said. He set the envelope on the workbench. "If you're receiving this, it means the outcome she feared most has occurred and the backpack reached you." He looked at Ridge. "She gave me specific instructions. A letter, sealed, addressed to the president of the Black Crows MC. I was not told its contents." Ridge picked up the envelope. It was sealed with tape over the flap, the tape signed across in ink. Claire Rowan's signature, he assumed, though he'd never seen her handwriting before. He broke it and removed a single folded page. The handwriting was small and precise. He read it once, then again. Then he folded it and held it for a moment. Dex was watching him. "What does it say?" Ridge looked up. He looked around the room, at Dex, at Cass, at Polly, in the doorway, at Fitch standing with his careful stillness by the workbench, at the envelope, at the fluorescent light, at all of it. He said, "It says she knew about Dex." The room went very quiet. "She says it in the letter." Ridge kept his voice flat. "She says she found the entry in the ledger and she investigated it, and she determined it was a single transaction under family duress, and she made a choice not to include it in the evidence package she sent to authorities." He paused. "She says she included it in a separate sealed file held by Fitch, to be opened only if the club turned the child over to county custody or abandoned the situation." He looked at Dex. "She watched us for 4 months. She saw you too." And she decided the man who did one bad thing for his sister was still worth trusting with her daughter. The silence had a different quality now. Dex's face had done something that it didn't usually do. It had opened, very briefly, in the specific way of a man receiving something he doesn't know how to hold. Not forgiveness exactly, because the dead couldn't give that, but something adjacent to it. An acknowledgement across an impossible distance. A woman he'd never met had seen him at his worst and included him in her best hope. His jaw worked. He looked at the floor. Fitch cleared his throat quietly. "There is also this." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small device, a flash drive. "She delivered this to me 6 weeks ago. She said it contained the complete file, everything she had. And she said," he paused, consulting his own memory carefully. "She said that if it reached the right people at the right time, it would be enough to bring the entire structure down. Not just Rowan, all of it." Ridge took the drive. He held it in his palm. It weighed almost nothing. He thought about Claire Rowan sitting in a car on a dark county road for 4 months, watching these men. He thought about the patience of it, the terror of it, the love underneath it. A woman running out of time, making the most careful decision of her life with everything she had left. He thought about her voice on the recorder, flat and urgent and rehearsed, saying his name at the end. He thought about Maisie in the folding chair, pulling a blanket to her chin. He closed his hand around the drive. "Get Reyes back on the line," he said. Cass was already moving, but Fitch raised one hand. "Before you do," he said. He reached into the envelope a second time and produced a smaller sealed note. "She also asked me to give you this separately. She said to read it before you make any more calls." He held it out. Ridge took it. He opened it. It was 4 lines. "Ridge, the man who called you this morning, Deputy Waller, is not who matters. The law firm on your gravel is not who matters. The one who matters is already inside the federal process. His name is in the drive under the file marked Nest. He's been inside for 11 years. If you move without knowing this, you are handing him the drive directly." Ridge read it twice. 11 years. 11 years was exactly how long he'd been president of the Black Crows. He looked at the drive in his hand, at the partition door behind which Maisie was, at Fitch, who was watching him with the careful expression of a man who doesn't know what he's just delivered but knows it's heavy. Then he looked at his phone. Reyes. He'd been feeding Reyes the whole picture since this morning. He'd told her about the ledger, the recordings, the names. He'd told her about Harmon. He'd put the evidence in her hands piece by piece, believing he was building a case. And she had been moving it forward, and the intake order had come through, and everything had appeared to be working. He thought about the voice on the phone that morning. Professional, careful, moving exactly as fast as Ridge needed. Exactly as fast. He looked at Dex. Dex was already looking at him. Already there. He'd heard it in Ridge's face again, the same way he'd heard the first thing. And this time his expression was not the expression of a man receiving his own exposure. It was the expression of a man watching the ground shift under someone else. "Don't call her back," Dex said quietly. Ridge looked at the phone in his hand. At the call still technically on hold. At the drive. At the note that said you are handing him the drive directly. Outside on the gravel, the black SUV from the law firm was still there. The county vehicles were still there. And somewhere inside the federal process that was supposed to be saving them, a name was waiting in a file marked Nest, a name that had been inside for 11 years, a name that had been watching this the same way Claire Rowan had watched it, except from the other side, with entirely different intentions. Ridge disconnected the call. He stood in the silence of the garage and held the drive and the note and the weight of everything Claire Rowan had built and hidden and ultimately died to protect. And he understood, finally, completely, the full scale of what she had placed in his hands. This was not a local problem. This was not a corrupt sheriff and a circuit court judge and a man with money and connections in Berkfield County. This was something that had fingers in places he hadn't looked yet. Something that had been built over years and maintained from the inside. Something that had survived multiple attempts to dismantle it because the people dismantling it were being watched from within their own walls. And a dying woman had seen all of it. And she had packed a backpack. And she had sent her daughter down a frozen road in the dark because the only people she could trust were the ones with nothing left to lose and no institution left to be corrupted by. He looked at Dex. Get the drive copied, he said. Multiple copies. Different physical locations. Who do we send it to? Ridge looked at the 4 lines of Claire Rowan's handwriting. He thought about Holloway, the retirement that wasn't, the careful reluctance on the phone this morning, the 3 weeks of sitting on the parallel evidence. Holloway, who had known before Ridge called him. Holloway, who had recommended Reyes. He thought about the word nest and what it meant to name something that way. A nest being something built from the inside, built to hold something, built to last. Not Holloway, he said. Then who? Ridge thought about what you did when the system was the problem. When the institution was compromised at levels deep enough that the fix couldn't come from inside it. He thought about what Claire Rowan had done. She hadn't gone up the chain. She hadn't trusted the chain. She'd gone outside it entirely, to the most outside thing she could find, and she'd bet everything on the proposition that outsiders could sometimes go where insiders couldn't. He looked at the flash drive. He looked at Fitch. Do you have contacts at the press? He asked. Fitch blinked. I have one. An investigative journalist. She's been working the organized crime beat in eastern Kentucky for 4 years. Is she clean? As clean as anyone I've met in a long time. Get her on the phone, Ridge said, right now. Outside, on the gravel, one of the county vehicles started its engine. Not moving, just running. The sound of it came through the bay door low and steady, like a warning being maintained at idle. And somewhere beyond the tree line, the sky had gone the specific shade of gray that meant the snow was going to come harder before it stopped. And Ridge stood in the center of his garage with a dead woman's drive in his hand and her 4 lines of handwriting in his pocket and 14 men around him and a child behind the partition door, and understood that the moment he made the next call, there was no shape of this that didn't require him to become something he'd spent 11 years trying not to need to be again. Not the criminal, not the man from before North Point, something older than that. Something that existed in men before institutions did, before law did, before any of the structures that were supposed to make violence unnecessary had been built. The thing that remained when all of those structures failed, when the courts were owned and the badges were bought, and the federal process had a name sitting inside it like a... The journalist's name was Dana Croft, and she answered on the second ring. Fitch had her number memorized, which told Ridge something about how long this had been building on the outside of the walls Ridge hadn't known to look at. He put the call on speaker and set the phone on the workbench and said 4 words before she could ask who was calling. I have the drive. Silence. Then, where are you? Burkefield County. I need a secure upload point and I need it in the next 20 minutes before the federal hold expires and they come through my door. I have a server. Is it clean? It's not connected to anything with a federal address. Good enough. He took the drive and handed it to Sal, who was already at the laptop they kept in the back office for billing. My man is uploading now. Everything on it goes to you simultaneously. You publish what you can verify in the next hour. Whatever you can't verify yet, you hold, but you tell your editor you have it. If I publish without full verification, the name in the nest file, Ridge said, run it against the federal employee database. It'll verify itself. A pause on the line. He could hear her breathing, could hear the specific quality of a person recalibrating against information that was larger than they'd prepared for. How did you get this? A woman who died to build it. 3 seconds of silence. Uploading now, Sal said from the back office. Outside, the county vehicle that had been idling cut its engine. That was wrong. An idling engine stopping meant a decision had been made. Ridge looked at Dex, and Dex was already moving to the window. 2 of them are out of the vehicle, Dex said. Flat, precise. Moving toward the east side. Cass. Already up, Cass called from the loft. Hold, Ridge said. Nobody moves until they touch the building. Dana Croft was still on the line. I've got the upload. It's coming through. Her voice had changed. The journalist's register now, the one that ran on adrenaline and discipline simultaneously. The nest file. Ridge, this name. I know. This person has been coordinating evidence suppression across 4 federal districts for... I know, he said. That's why it goes public before it goes back through any federal channel. Once it's public, it can't be buried. They'll come after you. They're already here. The east wall took the first impact at 9:47 p.m. Not a vehicle. A ram, handheld, the kind tactical teams used on doors, hitting the side entrance with enough force to buckle the frame on the first swing. The sound of it went through the garage like a physical thing, a concussion that rattled the overhead lights and sent vibration through the concrete floor into the soles of every boot in the building. Maisie made a sound behind the partition. One sound, quickly controlled. "Back office," Ridge said to Theo without turning around. "Take her to the back office. Lock the interior door. Don't open it for anything except my voice." Theo was through the partition in 4 seconds. The side door came in on the third ram. It swung hard and fast, and the men who came through it were not county deputies in patrol gear. They were in tactical black, no insignia, moving with the specific compressed efficiency of people who had done this in other buildings on other nights, and knew exactly how much time they had and intended to use all of it. 3 came through the side door. 2 more through the bay door simultaneously, which meant someone had gotten the exterior lock off. In the time Ridge's attention had been on the side wall, which meant they'd been working both approaches at once, which meant this wasn't improvised. This had been timed. Ridge had 14 men. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. It was not the orchestrated violence of a film where everyone moves correctly and the choreography makes sense. It was the ugly, physical, exhausting reality of a confined space, and too many bodies and men who had been trained in different schools of violence meeting in a concrete room full of motorcycle parts. Polly took the first man through the bay door with a shoulder check that redirected the momentum and put the man into the workbench hard enough to leave a dent in the steel. The man's head hit the edge of the bench, and he went down and didn't come back up. Polly stood over him, breathing through his nose, hands flexing, and then turned to find the next one. Garrett took a hit to the ribs from a baton, felt it immediately, the specific deep ache of a strike that hasn't broken anything but has strongly suggested it could, and absorbed it and kept moving because Garrett had been hit before in ways that mattered more than this, and the body remembered the difference. Dex moved like someone for whom this was a language spoken fluently, economically, without waste. 2 men. 30 seconds, both down. He came out of it with a cut above his eyebrow that he didn't acknowledge and moved immediately to the next problem, which was a third man who had gotten past the initial engagement and was moving toward the partition wall. Ridge intercepted him. He was 51 years old and had 4 years of prison behind him, and 11 years of leading men who were themselves built from damage. And what his body remembered was not youth, but efficiency. The kind that comes from understanding exactly how much force a situation requires and not using more than that, because more than that was its own kind of problem. He put the man down with 2 movements, and the man stayed down, and Ridge stepped over him and kept moving. The loft. Cass was up there with a sight line on the main floor and the specific restraint of a man who had been told hold and intended to hold until that instruction changed, and the restraint was costing him. Ridge could see it in the locked tension of his shoulders and the white of his knuckles on the rail. "Cass," Ridge said. "East window." Cass moved. The east window faced the gravel lot where 2 more vehicles had materialized out of the dark, their headlights cutting through the thin snow that had started falling in the last 10 minutes. And the figures moving between them were not tactical. They were suits. The law firm SUV was still there, and 2 of the suits were on phones, and one of them was Victor Rowan. Ridge had never seen him in person. He knew him from a photograph Fitch had shown him. Early 50s, the particular grooming of a man who had made money early and spent 20 years reinforcing the impression of it. He looked, from the east window, exactly like that photograph, except for his expression, which was the expression of a man watching a building that was supposed to have delivered a result by now, and hadn't. "That's him," Lenny said from beside Ridge. He'd come up the loft stairs with a gash along his forearm from something in the main floor scuffle, holding it closed with his other hand, and his voice was completely steady. "Right there in the open." "He thinks the legal architecture protects him," Ridge said. "He doesn't come close, he watches." "Then we give him something to watch." Ridge looked at Lenny, then at the drive, the copy Sal had made, sitting in Ridge's jacket pocket, the original already uploaded and in Dana Croft's hands and transmitting to a server that had no federal address. He took out his phone. He called the number Holloway had given him that morning, not Reyes, Holloway directly. It rang once. "Callahan?" The nest file, Ridge said. You know who it is? A pause. Yes. Did you know before today? A longer pause. I had a suspicion. I didn't have proof. You have it now. It's on Croft's server and it goes public in 40 minutes unless someone with federal authority arrests that person in the next 30. He looked out the east window at Victor Rowan standing in the snow beside his SUV. And I have the man who built the whole structure standing in my gravel lot right now, Holloway. I need someone with a badge and clean jurisdiction here in 20 minutes. Ridge, 20 minutes. He hung up. Downstairs, the main floor had gone quiet in the specific way of a space where the acute violence has passed, and what remains is its aftermath. Men breathing hard, some sitting against walls, some still standing, the overhead lights doing their indifferent work on everything below. 5 men in tactical black, down, some conscious, none moving with any urgency. His own men, standing. All of them standing, in various states of damage, but upright, which was the only thing that mattered. Dex was at the bottom of the loft stairs, blood from the cut above his eye tracking down the side of his face, not wiping it. He looked up at Ridge. His expression was the expression of a man who has just been through something and is on the other side of it and is taking inventory of where he is. It hold? Ridge asked. It held. Casualties? Garrett's ribs, Lenny's arm. Cass took a hit to the shoulder he's not admitting to. He paused. Nothing that doesn't walk. Ridge came down the stairs. The floor was what it was. He'd seen worse, and so had most of the men in the room. He walked through it to the partition door and knocked twice, his knock, and said, "It's me." The lock clicked. The door opened. Theo was standing in the doorway of the back office, and behind him, sitting on the floor with her back against the desk, was Maisie. She had her knees pulled to her chest, and the stuffed animal from the backpack, the one with the single button eye, held against her sternum, and when she saw Ridge, she did not run to him. She looked at him with those old eyes, and she assessed him the way she'd assessed everything, carefully, completely, without flinching from what she found. "Is it done?" she asked. He crouched down in front of her. He had blood on his knuckles from the main floor, and he was breathing harder than he'd like. And somewhere in the last 4 minutes, he'd taken a hit to his left side that he hadn't fully registered yet, and was beginning to. "Not yet," he said, "but almost." "My dad is outside." "I know." "He's not going to stop," she said. "He never stops." Ridge looked at her. He thought about the drive in his pocket. He thought about Dana Croft's server and the 40-minute clock and Holloway on the other end of a phone call that needed to produce a badge and clean jurisdiction before the clock ran out. He thought about a woman in a car on a dark county road, watching, calculating, choosing. He thought about what it meant to finish something, not to survive it, not to get through it, but to finish it, to take it all the way to the end that made every cost mean something. "He will tonight," Ridge said. Outside, through the high windows, the snow was coming down harder now, and the gravel lot was white at the edges where the security light didn't reach, and Victor Rowan was still standing beside his SUV in the cold, on the phone, waiting for a result that wasn't coming, and somewhere in the distance, far enough to be imagination, close enough to be real, came the sound of engines. Not the vehicles in the lot. Something else. Something on the county road, coming from the direction of the highway, more than one. The specific low thunder of Harleys pushed hard through cold air. The snow had stopped somewhere around 4 in the morning. Nobody noticed when it happened. There was too much else to track. The federal vehicles still parked at the junction, the last of the mercenaries being walked out in zip ties across frozen gravel. The EMTs working under portable lights on the east side of the building where Garrett had gone down with a graze across his left shoulder that looked worse than it was, and bled in the convincing way that shallow wounds do. The snow had simply stopped, quietly, without announcement, and by the time the sky began its slow move from black to the specific blue-gray that came before dawn, the gravel lot was a sheet of white that nobody had walked on yet, unmarked, clean in a way nothing else around the garage was. Ridge sat on the running board of Lenny's truck and held a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and didn't drink it. His right hand had a cut across the palm from where a chain-link fence had found it in the dark. and someone had wrapped it with gauze that was now more brown than white. And he was aware of the hand the way you're aware of something after the adrenaline leaves. Not pain exactly, more like information arriving late. His coat had a tear in the left shoulder. His boots were soaked through. He had been awake for 22 hours, and his body had moved past exhaustion into the particular country on the other side of it, where everything was very clear and very slow, and the ordinary weight of things felt briefly manageable. Across the lot, Dex was talking to a federal agent, not Reyes, someone else, a younger man with a clipboard who had been taking statements for the last hour. Dex was talking in the flat, even way he had, his hands in his jacket pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold. He'd been talking to federal agents for most of the night, and he would be talking to them for a long time after this, and what came out of those conversations would determine a lot of things about the next chapter of his life. Ridge looked at him across the white gravel, and Dex looked back, briefly. And what passed between them was not absolution, and was not accusation. It was something older and quieter. The look of two men who had been through the same fire from different angles and come out the other side still standing, still facing each other, with the full knowledge of what that cost. Ridge looked back at his cold coffee. The journalist? Her name was Sandra Yee, 4 years on the organized crime beat, and she had arrived at the garage at 11 the previous night in a car that smelled like printer ink and fast food and urgency, had filed her first piece from the parking lot at 2 in the morning, working off the flash drive and the ledger copies and an interview with Fitch that had lasted 40 minutes. By the time the mercenaries arrived at the compound, the first version of the story was already in her editor's queue. By the time federal agents were walking people out in zip ties, the story had been shared enough times that pulling it back was no longer a viable option for anyone who might have wanted to. That was what Claire Rowan had understood that Ridge hadn't, not fully, until he'd held the drive in his hand and read the 4 lines of her handwriting. The evidence wasn't the weapon. The evidence made public was the weapon. The difference between those two things was the difference between a locked safe and a lit fuse, and she had built the fuse before she'd built anything else. He thought about her a lot in the hours after the fighting stopped. He thought about her in the car on the county road, watching the garage through whatever she'd used. Binoculars, maybe? Or just the naked eye in the dark, counting lights, reading the movement of men. He thought about what she'd seen that had been worth betting everything on. He still didn't have a complete answer. He thought he might spend a long time looking for one. The side door of the garage opened and Lenny came out with a fresh mug and exchanged it for the cold one without ceremony. Ridge drank. "Garrett's okay," Lenny said. He sat down on the running board beside Ridge with the careful movement of a large man whose joints had been in the cold too long. "EMT says it's clean. They want to take him in for proper dressing." "He'll go?" "He'll argue about it for 20 minutes and then go." "Make sure he goes." Lenny was quiet for a moment. He had a bruise forming across his cheekbone from something that had happened near the bay door that Ridge hadn't seen directly, and his white beard had blood in it that wasn't his, and he was drinking coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug the way you drink things when your hands need something to do. "She slept through most of it," Lenny said. Ridge looked at him. "Maisie. We had her in the back storage room, the interior one, no windows. Theo stayed with her the whole time." Lenny looked at his coffee. "She didn't sleep easy, but she slept." Ridge thought about Theo, 23 years old, the youngest face in the September photograph, the kid who had explained carburetors with complete dedication because it was the only thing he had to offer, sitting in a windowless storage room in the dark, talking to a 6-year-old about tools and motorcycles while the world outside tried to come through the walls. He had not been asked to do that. He had simply done it, and Ridge made a note of it in the place where he kept the things that mattered. "How is she?" Ridge asked. "Quiet." Lenny paused. "She asked me if you were okay." Ridge looked at the white gravel. "She didn't ask if she was okay," Lenny said. "She asked about you." The sun came over the tree line at 6:47, which Ridge knew because he watched it happen. A slow, specific light that moved across the snow on the gravel and turned it from gray to white to a pale gold that had no business being as beautiful as it was given everything the ground had been through in the last 12 hours. He watched it move and drank his coffee and let it be what it was. Victor Rowan had been taken into federal custody at 3:42, 2 counties over, at the end of a 20-minute vehicle pursuit that had involved 3 federal units and ended when his driver misjudged a curve on an icy road and put the SUV into a drainage ditch. He was unhurt, which was not how Ridge would have written it, but was probably the right outcome. A dead man couldn't testify, and the architecture Rowan had built needed to come down in a way that held up in court, and that required him breathing and answering questions for a long time. The name in the Nest file, the federal insider, the 11-year corruption, had been arrested separately in the early morning by a team that had been assembled from outside the Lexington field office specifically because Reyes, to her credit, had flagged her own chain of command as potentially compromised the moment Ridge had disconnected the call. She hadn't known who. She'd known the disconnection meant something, and she'd been in the business long enough to trust that signal. Ridge had learned this from the younger agent with the clipboard who relayed it without editorializing, and Ridge had sat with it for a while and decided that Reyes was probably a person he'd been wrong about, and that being wrong about someone in the better direction was a rare enough experience to acknowledge. Harmon, the circuit court judge, had submitted to voluntary federal interview at 6 in the morning, which in Ridge's experience meant his lawyers had looked at the evidence and concluded that cooperation was the only remaining bargain. The custody petition he'd signed was being voided. That paperwork was already moving. Ridge knew all of this from the agent with the clipboard, who had briefed him in the flat, sequential way of someone delivering a grocery list. He had listened to all of it and nodded and said thank you, and when the agent had walked away, he'd sat back down on the running board and looked at the gravel and felt the distance between the facts and the weight of them. How one was just information and the other was everything. He heard the storage room door open inside the garage, heard small footsteps on the concrete floor, heard Theo's voice say something low and indistinct, and then Maisie came out through the side door into the cold morning light. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt over her clothes, Theo's probably, and her hair was still tangled from sleep, and her bare feet were in a pair of Cass's flip-flops that were approximately 4 sizes too large. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the gravel lot, at the federal vehicles, at the tire tracks in the snow, at the men moving through the aftermath of the night. And she took it in with the specific, calibrated attention of a child who had learned to read environments before she'd learned to trust them. Then she looked at Ridge on the running board. She crossed the lot to him in Cass's flip-flops, each step deliberate, the cold gravel showing around the edges of the rubber soles. She stopped in front of him and looked at the gauze on his hand. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Some," he said. She looked at it for another moment. Then she looked up at his face with the old eyes, the 9 years too old eyes, and did her assessment the way she always did. Thorough, unhurried, arriving at whatever conclusion she was going to arrive at through her own process. "Is it over?" she asked. He thought about what over meant, about Rowan in custody and Harmon cooperating, and the story already in circulation and the Nest file being processed and the legal machinery that would run for months before it produced anything that resembled a final answer. He thought about Dex and the conversations ahead and the cost of them. He thought about Garrett's shoulder and Lenny's bruised cheek and the tear in his own coat and the gauze on his palm. "The worst of it," he said. She looked at the white gravel. Something in her face shifted. Not relief. Not quite. Something more gradual. The way winter light changes when the cloud cover thins. The same light, but reaching further. "My mom would have wanted to know how it ended," she said. "Yeah." Ridge looked at the tree line. "I think she'd be satisfied." Maisie was quiet. Then, "She picked right, didn't she?" He looked at her. She was still looking at the gravel, and her expression had moved somewhere he hadn't seen it go before. Not the controlled, old expression, but something younger, something that was 6 years old and allowed to be just for a moment in the cold morning light with the worst of it behind them. "Yeah," he said. "She picked right." Maisie sat down on the running board beside him. She didn't ask. She just sat down, the flip-flops dangling above the gravel, both hands in the flannel shirt's front pocket. She was cold. He could feel it coming off her. And he shrugged out of his outer jacket without comment and put it around her shoulders, and she pulled it tight without comment, and they sat together in the early light, while the lot cleared around them and the federal vehicles ran their engines and the tree line held the edge of the new day. Lenny came out eventually and sat on the hood of the truck above them, which made the truck shift and creak in a way that should have been undignified but wasn't. Cass materialized at some point and leaned against the fender. Theo came out and stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. Polly, Garrett, shoulder-dressed and arguing with the EMT exactly as Lenny had predicted. Sal, the others, drifted back toward the garage in the way that the dispersed parts of something find their way back to center after the storm has passed. Not because anyone summoned them, but because it was where they belonged. 14 men and one small girl in the cold morning, and the neon crow above the bay door still flickering, and the smell of coffee coming from somewhere inside. The months that followed moved in the way that recovery moves. Not evenly, not cinematically, but in the particular rhythm of actual healing, which is to say with setbacks and adjustments and long stretches where nothing appeared to change, and then sudden mornings where the weight of something was simply different than it had been the day before. The legal process ran its course. Rowan was indicted on 37 counts, which became a number that felt abstract, and then gradually, over the weeks of coverage that Sandra Yee's initial story generated, became specific and real. Harmon's cooperation produced 7 additional names, 2 of which were in the NIST file, and 5 of which were new. The federal insider, the name Ridge had learned and would not say out loud for months afterward, pled guilty in early spring and was sentenced in the fall. Dex cooperated fully. The single transaction, the family duress, the 18 months of carrying it alone, it all came out in the federal record, clearly and without the distortion that came from withholding. The outcome was not nothing. There were consequences, legal and otherwise, that Dex accepted the way he accepted most things, without complaint, with the particular dignity of a man who has decided that the only currency worth spending is honesty. He remained in the garage. He remained in the club. He sat in the chair by the exit, and sometimes he talked about his sister, who was doing better, who had gotten out of the city, who called him on Sundays now. Ridge never brought up the ledger entry again. He didn't need to. Some things were resolved by being survived together, and that was the only resolution worth having. Garrett's shoulder healed in 6 weeks. Lenny's bruise was gone in 10 days. The tear in Ridge's coat was sewn by Maisie, who had decided that sewing was a skill she wanted to learn and had asked Lenny to teach her, and the stitches were uneven and strong, and Ridge wore the coat all winter. The lease notice from the county assessor, the piece of paper Ridge had put face down in the desk drawer the morning Maisie arrived, became something else by February. The investigation into Rowan's network had produced, among other things, documentation of the LLC that had bought the land under the garage, which turned out to be a shell entity connected to Rowan's financial infrastructure. When that infrastructure collapsed, the ownership of the land reverted to a probate proceeding that moved slowly through the same court system, now operating under entirely different management. The Black Crows were still on the land in spring. They were still on it in summer. The foundation was Sal's idea. He brought it to Ridge on a Tuesday in March, in the back office with the door closed, with papers and a quiet voice, and the specific careful energy of a man proposing something he's been thinking about for a long time. An organization. Legal, registered, with a board and bylaws and a stated mission. Protection services and advocacy for children in the eastern Kentucky counties where the institutional system had most visibly failed. The same counties in the ledger, the same geography where Rowan's network had operated in the shadows of official neglect for years. Ridge looked at the papers. He looked at Sal. "We're bikers," he said. "We're bikers who kept a kid alive when nobody else was going to," Sal said. "That's a qualification." Ridge thought about it for a long time. Then he said yes. The foundation had its first case in April, its third by May. By the following year, it had moved through 11 cases. 11 children in situations where the official channels had failed or been compromised or simply moved too slowly. 11 situations where a different kind of presence had made a different kind of difference. It was not clean work. It was not simple. It did not redeem anyone, and Ridge would have been suspicious of it if it had. Because redemption was a word for stories, and this was not a story. This was just work that needed doing, and men who had, for reasons that had more to do with the dead woman's calculations than with their own virtue, ended up positioned to do it. The courtroom hearing was in May. Ridge had not been in a courtroom since North Point. He sat in a suit that Lenny had located from somewhere, and that fit him adequately across the shoulders and too long in the sleeve. And he sat at the plaintiff's table with Sal beside him, and across the room was Victor Rowan's former legal team, now representing the estate, reduced and subdued, operating without the leverage that had made them formidable 6 months ago. The judge was new, not Harmon. Someone who had come into the seat clean, or as clean as anyone came into anything, which was imperfect but present. She read the record. She asked questions that Sal answered precisely and Ridge answered plainly. She looked at the documentation of the last 6 months, the garage, the foundation, the school enrollment, the medical records, the testimony from Fitch, and from a child psychologist who had been working with Maisie since December. She looked at Ridge for a long moment. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "do you understand what permanent guardianship means?" "I understand it means she's mine," Ridge said, "and I don't walk away from what's mine." The judge held his gaze. Then she looked at the papers in front of her and signed. It was Maisie who had insisted on being there, and it was Maisie who was sitting in the gallery with Lenny's large hand over her small ones. And when Ridge came through the gate from the plaintiff's table and walked toward her, her face did the thing he had watched it practice for 6 months now. The thing where the controlled expression let go, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way something carefully held is set down when you're finally sure the ground will hold it. She didn't run to him. She stood up from the bench and walked toward him, and when she reached him, she put her arms around his waist and pressed her face into the front of his coat. And he put one hand on the back of her head and held on, and neither of them said anything for a while. Lenny was crying, which he denied for the rest of the afternoon with great conviction and zero credibility. Later, that evening, the garage lit warm against the May dark. The bay doors opened to let the spring air in. The men arranged around the space with the easy geometry of people who had learned each other's weight and presence over time. Maisie sat on the tailgate of Lenny's truck with a plate of food she was not eating and watched the neon crow above the door. One wing still strobed. Nobody had fixed it, partly because nobody had gotten around to it, and partly because it had become, in some unspoken way, a part of what the garage was, the flickering thing that kept its light anyway. Ridge came and sat beside her on the tailgate. She offered him something from her plate. He took it. They ate in the noise of the garage, the voices, the music, the particular alive sound of the place. And outside on the highway, a truck went by, its headlights sweeping the gravel, and then it was gone, and the dark came back, and the neon crow flickered above the door. "She was right," Maisie said. Ridge looked at her. "My mom." She was still watching the crow. "She said the loud motorcycles would keep me alive." She paused. She didn't say anything about the rest of it, the staying, the home part. A beat. "I think she hoped for it, though." Ridge looked at the crow for a moment. The strobing wing, the red light bleeding out onto the gravel like it always had, like it had the night Maisie walked out of the dark and into it. "I think she knew," he said. Maisie considered that. Then she leaned against his arm. Not asking, not announcing, just the small weight of her settling into the space beside him the way water finds the shape of what holds it. He let her. Outside, down the highway, another set of headlights appeared and grew and passed, the sound of the engine rising and fading in the dark. And then it was quiet again, except for the garage and the men and the music and the spring night, and the neon crow above the door kept its light, strobing and imperfect and steady. The same as it had always been, the same as it would be. There were monsters in the world. There had always been monsters. The difference was not that the monsters were gone now. The case files in the Foundation's cabinet in the back office were proof enough of that. 11 folders and more coming, the work that didn't stop. The difference was that somewhere between a frozen back road in November and a May courtroom in a tailgate in the spring dark, a woman's last calculation had proven correct. The monsters had been kept away, and the men who kept them away were home.